You're listening to an event from the U.S. Institute of Peace, part of the USIP podcast network. For more information about our work around the world, visit usip.org and check us out on social media.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is George Moose, and as the acting president of the United States Institute of Peace, it's my pleasure to welcome you all this morning to this special event on disability inclusion and peacebuilding. And I also want to welcome all of those who are joining us online this morning. For those who may be coming to the Institute for the first time, the United States Institute of Peace is a national nonpartisan organization. It was established by an act of Congress in 1984, with the mission of helping to mitigate, resolve, and prevent violent conflicts around the world, and to help build peace in the wake of violent conflict. And our discussion this morning, I think, is particularly timely, since Tuesday, December the 3rd, was the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. And we're especially honored to welcome Sara Minkara, who in 2021 was appointed by President Biden to serve as Special Advisor for International Disability Rights. And in this role, Special Advisor Minkara leads the U.S. State Department's comprehensive strategy to promote and protect the rights of persons with disabilities internationally. Her pioneering work in promoting disability rights, diversity, access, and inclusion has taken her to more than 50 countries and has been instrumental in shaping the policies and the actions of both governmental organizations and non-governmental organizations. At a time when, sadly, the number of conflicts around the world is growing, as well as the intensity of those conflicts, her work has also had an important impact on the field of peacebuilding during a time of growing conflicts and growing intensity. People with disabilities make up 15% of the world's population, and they are disproportionately impacted by conflict. Yet they are often excluded from peacebuilding and from governance. Through our programs here at the Institute on Disability and Inclusive Peacebuilding, USIP is working to change this. That work begins, frankly, with making our own programs more inclusive. In addition, we are also developing dedicated programs in Colombia, in the Philippines, and in Central Africa to promote the leadership of people with disabilities in peacebuilding, and governance. Special Advisor Minkara's Playbook for Advancing Disability Rights Internationally, Nothing Without Us, has provided a vision for the modern disability movement and a model for how organizations should work to build greater inclusivity into their programs. Before I close, I would like to acknowledge my former USIP board colleague, John Lancaster, who served on the USIP board from 2011 to 2023 for his military service during the Vietnam War and the injuries that he suffered that left him paralyzed from the waist down. John was the recipient of both a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. As a civil rights attorney, director of Maryland's Office for Individuals with Disabilities, and later as director of the National Council on Independent Living, John was a fierce champion for disability rights and inclusion. He was also a constant source of both inspiration and guidance to the USIP board as we sought to make our own work more inclusive. I hope that he's watching us online this morning. I know that he would have wished to be with us in person, to welcome Special Advisor Minkara and to celebrate her work. And so I'm pleased now to turn the floor over to Elizabeth Murray, who will moderate the conversation this morning. Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Moose and Special Advisor Minkara. Let me echo Ambassador Moose's welcome. We are so honored to have you here today and very eager to benefit from your expertise on inclusion. Likewise, a very warm welcome to everyone who's here with us in person and our audience online. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation on disability-inclusive peacebuilding. Over the next half hour or so, I will ask the Special Advisor a series of questions on disability rights, disability and conflict, and disability inclusion in foreign policy. And then we'd like to give our audience a chance to interact with the Special Advisor. We will have time for a few brief questions or comments from the audience members here in person, and we will also take questions from online. So if you're watching us online, please feel free to start putting your questions in the comment box. Special Advisor, I'd like to start with a framing question. Your role involves working with U.S. partners around the world to advance leadership on disability rights. But unfortunately, what we've seen is that people with disabilities are often left out of conversations on conflict and peacebuilding. So can you start by telling us why it is critical to include people with disabilities in peace processes and peacebuilding?
Awesome. Well, first of all, thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Ambassador. And I just want to thank USIP for organizing this event. We're really happy to be here. And I do want to always say it's not just my work, it's the team's work. And I have with me here Hannah Nasri, Megan Klahasi, Andrea Sidier, and Robin Trutman. You guys can raise your hands or something. There we go. They're the team. So, and team who are not with us, right? So they're the ones that really do the work with me. So to kind of frame the conversation and the landscape, right? Let's take a step back, because the question that you ask is, why are persons with disabilities not brought to the table when we're talking about peace, building, and conflict, right? And why is it important? But let's actually take a step back and ask ourselves the question, why are we left out of these conversations? But we're also left out of most conversation. Why is that the reality? And it goes back to the narrative that we have globally around disability, how the society sees the disability community. We're either seen from a point of vulnerability. You know, we're called vulnerable population, and I always say we're not vulnerable because we're disabled. We're vulnerable because society and systems don't think about us. Then we're seen from a point of let's fix you versus fixing the system and society. You know, I would rather fix you, there's something wrong with you, versus fixing the society and system and making policies and systems and society and spaces more inclusive and accessible for all and breaking down barriers. Then society might say, okay, you want us to fix? It's a special thing, it's a different thing, it's a burden, it's costly, it's an add-on. And I want to emphasize on the costly, right? We're seen as to fix the system, it's going to be so much harder work, it's more costly, it's difficult, a burden, because we're not seen as part of the norm. We're not seen as part of the baseline of the system. We're seen as an add-on. Those are three narratives that still exist all over the world. And we're still not seeing that actually when you bring us to the table, not only when you break down barriers so we are able to be at the table, this benefits everyone, actually, when you make a system, society inclusive and accessible for all, but you're also bringing our voices of contribution versus we become individuals of burden, you know, becoming a burden to the society. That lens and that narrative is still not there, and we need to address that. We need to disrupt that. So when it comes to conflict and peace building, we're not seen as individuals that and communities that we can bring value. We're at best seen as people that need to be protected. But most of the time, we're not even seen. And I think this goes back to the question, how can we how can we really disrupt and say, we are no longer an acceptable loss when it comes to conflict and crisis? Because right now, we are an acceptable loss. And this goes back to the point of we're not counted. We're not documented. Data is not collected. Disaggregated data is not collected. So when data is not collected and our story not shared, then we're not seen. So this goes back to that point of we need to really disrupt the narrative from the baseline.
Thank you so much. I loved what you said about flipping the narrative from just focusing on vulnerability to bringing in people with disabilities as contributors and as leaders. So thank you for that framing. That was really important. And so we've talked about the why. Why are we bringing people with disabilities to the table? Can you tell us a little bit more about the how? What do you think are the specific actions that policymakers and stakeholders can take to include people with disabilities at the table in peace building?
So policymakers, peace builders, and FYI, it's estimated, and you guys might have more accurate numbers than this, 6.7% of peace agreements have any mention of disability. That's pretty low, even though we are 16% of the world's population. What can we do? First, how do you intentionally bring the disability community to the table? There's organizations of persons with disabilities across the globe in our local communities. How do we intentionally reach out to them, bring them to the table, and not just from a technical lens? And I'm going to emphasize that. So many of us might just want to check off the box. Okay, this community is just checking off the box. I really want us to internalize and reflect and understand and see and believe that bringing the disability community is not only the right thing to do because it is a community that's part of our society, but it brings value. So please make sure you're reaching out to your OPD community. Please make sure you're bringing these voices to our media, social media spaces. Please make sure you're constantly asking the question, is the disability voice reflected? And that is part of everyone's work. It's not part of one specific policymaker sector. No, it's part of all of our work. So all of you in this room and virtually listening in, make sure, think about what work are you doing and how do you intentionally reach out to the disability community to be part of that work.
Thank you. I thought what you said about not checking the box was so important. It's about bringing the OPDs in from the very outset of a program, of a process, so that they can be contributing their expertise for the entire time. So thank you for flagging those important actions.
And just to that point, like you said, bringing the disability voice from the design of the program, the thought of the program, the design of the program, the implementation of the program, the evaluation of the program, accountability towards the program. I've had so many conversations with folks and say, well, we do have a disability policy. Well, where's the accountability on the ground? Because when it comes to crisis, this is where we lose accountability a lot of time. And people with disabilities are disproportionately impacted. We need to create more accountability, and we need to bring the disability voice from the beginning, like you said.
Absolutely. People with disabilities as trainers and experts as well, I think. I'd like to talk a bit about your work. I have several questions about your work, and I'm sure those in the audience will as well. One of the goals for your office is to promote the human rights of persons with disabilities in countries experiencing crises. I was wondering if you could speak to some of the initiatives that your office and the State Department have pursued to this end in conflict zones, please.
So high level, from the beginning, when we set our strategy for our office and our work, one of the main priorities is disability in moments of crisis, right? And understanding that there's many layers to that. There's disability. How do you bring the disability voice into the emergency planning for governments and policies? It's, I think, only 8% of emergency plans when it comes to climate crisis actually bring in the disability voice. It's pretty low. So emergency planning. Then when a crisis hits, there's many gaps when it comes to humanitarian assistance and evacuation when it comes to disability in crisis and the community not being able to reach the aid and assistance. Then when we talk about negotiation, when we talk about peace building, when we talk about recovery and reconstruction, it's all these different layers. So a couple things that we've done is we focus a lot on Ukraine, and from the beginning moments of really understanding where are the gaps for people with disabilities in Ukraine in terms of reaching humanitarian aid, accessing bomb shelters, evacuation, etc. And then also Ukrainian refugees with disabilities that we went out to Moldova and Romania to understand their needs and their gaps and their challenges. And then now with the recovery, reconstruction, how do we ensure accessibility is baked into all efforts when it comes to Ukraine recovery, reconstruction conversation? There's still more work to be done. But on even a higher level, we've joined the Munich Security. We attended the Munich Security Conference this past February with the Secretary to talk about disability and security. We've had conversations with NATO. right now there's a women, peace and security strategy within NATO. How do we have something similar on disability, peace and security within NATO, right? There is a UN Security Council Resolution 2475, but there needs to be more focus on that when it comes to the global community and implementation of disability, peace and security. So there's a lot of different efforts that our office has been doing, but also from a very technical lens. That playbook that you mentioned, that has been distributed to all of our U.S. embassies, it illustrates how disability is cross-cutting, including crisis, and how we need to make sure that disability needs to be part of that.
Thank you. And you actually touched on my next question, which was about preparation. It feels like so many efforts with governments, with organizations like ours, are focused on responding to crises. And so I'm curious if you have any additional recommendations about how to support the disability community to be more involved in preparing for conflict and natural disasters.
Really good question. It goes back to the point of any government agency that has an emergency response policy or plan, even embassies as well, even whatever entity that thinks about crisis response, how do you ensure that you bring the disability community to the table when you're thinking about designing these policies to make sure there's accessibility baked in, accessible communication, accessible, evacuation methods, across the board, with the understanding that this not only protects their needs, but also it will benefit the entire population. And I think accessible emergency response plans benefits everyone. And I think that's an important lens to really understand, because as well, during crisis, more disability will be created. There'll be additional challenges. And when accessibility is made, and these emergency response are made easy for people with disabilities, it will benefit everyone. And I think that's something that we need to keep emphasizing on.
That's such a great point, and something that we've tried to discuss here at USIP, that actions to make programs more accessible benefit people with disabilities and benefit many other communities as well. Yep. So thank you for that. I wanted to talk about what I see is a disconnect in many countries between national policies, between countries that have signed and ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and how people with disabilities are treated in communities, particularly rural communities. And so I'm wondering if you have any insights on how to effectively combat this deep and harmful stigma at the same time as we're continuing to push, national level policies. How do you work at the community level to combat this harmful stigma?
That's a really good question, and I think there's a few different layers to this. First is, again, to combat the stigma, to combat this adaptive work and adaptive challenge, we need to first create a space where we have the difficult conversation of what does society think of us, right? And I think we don't have enough of those conversations. And it's either society sees us as a burden, or it's a charity, as a pity, as special needs, as whatever you want to call it, or costly. And I think we need to have those difficult conversations and address them. The second thing is, let's take it a step further and then society says, yeah, this is important for us. Again, we're at best stuck at the social protection lens. Disabilities housed within the Ministry of Social and Labor. We're only seeing from let's protect their rights. We're not seeing from the economic lens. We're not seeing from the contributor lens. We're not seeing from a political security lens. And I think this goes back to how do we also bridge and help the disability community have conversation across these other spaces and other sectors. Another point is, how do we also get society to, because ultimately society is the one that creates more accountability, to see us through those different lenses. And this goes back to how do we engage with media more intentionally, social media more intentionally, influencers, entertainment sectors. We've actually had many different sessions. Like for instance, when we went out to Turkey, our embassy organized an amazing roundtable with Netflix, TRT, all these different kind of entertainment folks, producers with a disability community and local government to talk about narrative. So how do we think creatively, bringing different sectors together to talk about narrative change? And then finally, we need to, the private sector can play a really huge role. Right now, when I travel the world and I talk to the private sector, they're very much just stuck on inclusive employment and quota laws. And it's more than that. And I think the private sector can play a huge role in reframing these conversations. So these are a few different ideas, but ultimately, one, the disability community, how do we help them connect to other spaces within government and beyond? And then two is disrupting the narrative to talk to the media, social media, and really, but ultimately we need to have these difficult conversations. Lastly, creating more shared responsibility. So whenever we used to travel, with our embassies, we always ask our embassies, we don't want to just meet with the Ministry of Social, Labor, Education, and Health. We want to meet with the Minister of Trade or Investment or Digital Economy, because these are the ministries that need to be thinking about us. And every single time we meet with these ministers, they're like, we've never thought about this topic before. So there's still a lot of work to be done. So our approach is talk to folks that have not been thinking about us.
Thank you. That was great and extremely useful. It made me think a bit about how the motto of the disability community has changed from nothing about us without us to just nothing without us. People with disabilities can and should be in every conversation, not just about disability rights, but about every governance issue, an economic issue, as you said. So thank you for that. Something that you said made me think of the work that you've done as advancing disability rights, but also as diplomacy, as helping to bridge divides. And I'm wondering if you can speak about something that I've heard said a few times, that disability can be an issue that brings parties together that may not otherwise come together. Have you found that to be true in your work?
Yes. There's two layers to that. I'm going to talk about how disability is an amazing diplomacy tool, but I'm going to also talk about how people with disabilities can be amazing diplomats. So the first part is countries and governments all over the world are open to work on disability. And we've seen this over and over again. So for instance, earlier in September, we were in Turkmenistan. And we had an amazing trip with a lot of government meetings, and every meeting we came out of it with productive outcomes and next steps, right? And it's hard to do that in other issue sets. So disability is a space where countries are willing to work with us on it. Let's use that, and let's work on doing good work on disability inclusion. So I think that's very much an underutilized issue. For me, I'm like, let's use it so we can do good work on disability. But the second layer to this is people with disabilities make amazing diplomats. Why? We as a disability community, when we come into a space, we'll say, we need to make this accessible in this way. Let's make sure this room is accessible. Where's, for me, for instance, where's this person sitting? And then I don't read off of script. And because I don't read off of a script, because I'm blind, I become more authentic, and the person becomes more human authentic, and we have an amazing constructive conversation and dialogue. And I see this over and over again with people with disabilities who are diplomat, because we have to make the space more inclusive and accessible for us. That actually creates a more human connection, which leads to people then saying, oh my God, I can also be my human self, and we can actually connect on a human level, which leads to more constructive conversation.
That was so thought-provoking about authenticity and connection. Thank you for that. I have so many more questions for you, but I'm going to limit myself to one so we can go to the audience. I was wondering if we could move beyond conflict and peace building to talk about what does a disability-inclusive foreign policy look like in a broader sense. Removing barriers toward and enabling greater disability inclusion in U.S. foreign policy is something that I understand that you've worked towards. And I was wondering if this might be an opportunity also to discuss in greater depth, if you're willing, the playbook and some of the recommendations for broader U.S. foreign policy.
So what does a truly disability inclusive foreign policy look like is where every single dialogue, let's take G7 for instance. Okay, so G7 has ministerial meetings and dialogues throughout the year on what? AI, climate, trade, investment. I can go on forever, right? All these different dialogues and meetings. I would like for all of these dialogues to have a disability lens. We're far from there. I would like our colleagues that are working on AI and the AI ministerial meetings to have an AI and disability lens. Climate. And again, not just from a social protection lens or protection lens, but from a lens that we can be innovators and problem solvers and contributors to the AI world. People don't realize so many technology and so many innovations actually came from the disability community. Text messaging, for example, or the automatic captioning on Microsoft Teams, all these different things. But again, we don't know that, right? So, and society is not thinking about that. So, disability inclusive foreign policies, where every single minister that is leading these different topics understand that disability should be a part of it.
Thank you. That was really powerful and an important, I think, rallying call for everyone in the room and everyone online. These remarks were so rich, and as I said, I could converse with you for so long, but I'd love to go to our audience. So I'd invite anyone in the room who wants to ask a question to raise their hand. We'd ask you to state your name and your organization, and then offer your brief question or comment. And we'll also be taking questions from online that will be brought up to the stage soon. So please, anyone in the room, we'd love to hear from you.
Yes, hi, I'm Jake Goodman. I'm with the Mediators Beyond Borders Disability Mediation Working Group. And I also used to actually I was interned at the State Department and, worked with Sara Minkara on a couple things.
I remember you.
And I'm actually, trying to get back into, that field more professionally.
Oh, okay.
And I actually took the Foreign Service Officer test recently, but because I agree, we need more people with disabilities in the diplomatic community, but as we do realize that, we also need to realize that right now there are, threats to the disability community from various angles, in terms of, whether, the rise of certain authoritarian regimes trying to roll back DEI protections, even, here in our own country with, the incoming administration's critical aim at a lot of, DEI and, quote unquote bureaucratic overreach that they think is happening. How do we protect individuals with disabilities from this and ensure that disability rights around the world are maintained properly against these threats like this? And then two, I've been doing a lot of research on the intersectionality of disability and climate, especially like looking at how we can improve public transportation and, use the topic of disability as a catalyst for reasoning to improve public transportation in car-centric countries. How can we promote this message in like the UNFCCC framework and, in the global climate lens when it's often undermined and not talked about?
Thank you so much for these questions. So on the last part, I think what's important is for the disability community in the field of climate to partner up with mainstream climate organization that can help amplify and elevate this work and really bring it forward. And then I would say, on the other hand, mainstream organizations that are working on climate, my ask always is, how do you make sure you're bringing the disability community forward? And a side point to this is, in traveling the world, I've had conversation with, women organization, pro-democracy organization, all these different things, and a lot of times they're not thinking about this disability lens too. So I think we need to make sure we're intentional with intersectionality and making sure that, so this is not just government work, this is also mainstream civil society needing to be bringing the disability community more intentionally forward. How do we protect the rights of individuals with disabilities in certain countries and spaces? I think, again, civil society plays a huge role to create more accountability with their government. I think we need to be sharing a lot of these perspectives through media and social media. And I think partnership and allyship is really important to help create more of that consistency and that power and also showcase the importance of making sure people with disabilities are at the table. One last point that as you were talking, it made me think about a question that you asked me earlier, Elizabeth, and I wanted to just share. We also need to bring this topic forward in our public policy schools, our academic institutions. Academic institutions are focusing on public policy, a lot of them are not thinking about disability and the intersection of disability policy into this work in a cross-cutting way. And students are graduating, becoming policymakers, joining agencies like the State Department and beyond, and they're not thinking about this topic. So my ask of anyone that's working in the academic institution and spaces, make sure this topic is brought forward more intentionally. Again, not just from a social lens, from an economic lens and a security lens, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my ask too.
Thank you very much. Can we turn to anybody else in the room who'd like to ask a question? And I know we have a few questions from online as well. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Emily Hardman, and I also serve at the State Department in the Bureau of African Affairs. And I just am a big admirer of everything that the office does. But I partially work on programming, and I was really interested in some of your comments, Sara Minkara, just about how to incorporate accessibility and disability rights in all different aspects of programming, all the way from the design up through the accountability and the monitoring and evaluation of programming. And I'm wondering, in your travels and in the instances that you've had to kind of examine some of the programs around the world that focus on this topic, what have you seen be the most successful, or are there some disciplines that you would recommend as we look at advancing the topic of disability and inclusion in our programming?
Thank you so much, Emily. So good to hear your voice. So I would say a couple things. Actually, USA just came out with their disability policy. They just published their disability policy, which I recommend everyone to take a look at it. I think that will be a good guideline for the work, and a huge thanks to Kathy Guernsey, who actually worked on it with her team. And then also in the State Department, we do have DRL Global Programming on Disability, Alison Aslan, who also leads a lot of this work. And the intentionality that they do when they are mapping out their programming and how to ensure that their programming are aligned to policy efforts and policy advancing certain policies. So I would look at it a few different ways. One is what more we need to do is how do we ensure all of our programming efforts are inclusive and accessible of the disability lens? And a lot of time it is hard when it comes to on the ground for organizations to really implement that. And I think this is where we need to support in terms of how, and this is where embassies can be a huge support in terms of helping them connect to OPD communities and helping them, making sure that in their design and implementation, the OPD communities are part of that process. And then also from a global lens, we need more of a systemic lens in terms of where funding going towards what issues and what are certain global gaps, right? There is a network called the Global Action on Disability, which is a network of donor countries and international organizations focusing on disability inclusive development. And that's what GLAD is working on, is kind of mapping out globally what are the different issue sets and where are the gaps, and how do we make sure there's more support going to certain issue sets that we're not focusing on. But there's still more efforts to be done. I don't remember the number of how much funding goes to disability inclusive programming. That's more of my colleague's expertise. But again, my recommendation would be go to the USAID disability policy that was recently published, and I think that will be a good guidelines.
Thank you very much. I thought what you said about, what you and both Emily said about working towards disability inclusion from the very outset of a program was so important. I think that's something we can't emphasize enough in the room today, that this is, disability inclusion is, it's done so much better when we think about it from the very beginning of any process or program. So thank you.
Please don't just think about it as checking off the box. And I think that's really important. A lot of people just do it because, like, oh my God, I got funding and they're asking me to do this and I have to do this. We need to reframe that thought process. And I know some organizations really sometimes don't know how and don't know where to go to reach out to the disability community. And I think this is where we need to facilitate and help break down some of those barriers.
Thank you. Very important points. I'd love to take one more question or comment from the room and then a few from online, if that's all right. And then maybe we'll come back to the room at the end. Is there anybody else
Hello, good morning. Muhammad Ali from Islamic Relief USA. I wanted to ask, conflict crises seem, when you talk about just anybody, disabled or non-disabled, seems difficult to help those, find their freedom and to find their liberation and to find their safety. I wonder, is there any good examples you have, whether it's a current or historical example of just those who are disabled having their health and their humanity preserved? Is there any that you can share that we can, kind of model off, especially when we look at crises across the world today, whether that be in Sudan or civil wars, and that still have enduring effects, like in Somalia and in other places. Obviously, we see what's going on in Palestine, now again in Syria. So I'd love to hear, what your thoughts are in terms of if there's any current or historical models that we can look at in terms of where, those who are disabled have been protected.
To be pessimistic. Trying to think. Right now I'm like, because to be honest, I'm not even gonna, I don't think I'm answering your question or might answer your question. But anyways, we are disproportionately impacted. And anyone that tells me during crisis, everyone is impacted the same, no, people with disabilities are disproportionately impacted. A blind father reaching out and saying, I don't know how to protect my family and my kids, and I don't know how to evacuate and protect them, and then next day he gets killed, right? Like, these are stories, like, because people with disabilities are not able to access information, access evacuation, access all these different things. So we are disproportionately impacted. I think right now, over time, Ukraine has built up a lot of different efforts to be more inclusive to the disability community. There were challenges in the beginning and gaps in the beginning. So I would take a look at kind of how Ukraine has done this over time. There's been great organizations like Fight for Right and other OPDs that really pushed on the system and spoke up and said, we need to make sure disability is part of the framework of the humanitarian response and the effort. So, but in terms of best practices, I don't know, does anyone have a best practice? No? Yes?
Yes, hi. I'm Giorgio Musso from Rome 3 University, and I'm a member of the community of Sant'Egidio. Just since you were talking about best practices, one thing that comes to my mind is the humanitarian corridors that we opened in Italy with the community of Sant'Egidio and other religious organizations. We were able to evacuate from Syria, Iraq, and the Horn of Africa about 7,000 people, and to let them in Italy in a regular manner, and most of them, or at least many of them, were people with disabilities. These people are, let's say, selected in a third country. So, for example, for Syrian refugees in Lebanon, but then when they are stuck in Lebanon, they are undergoing different hardships, and we give them the opportunity to come to Italy and to, rebuild their own lives there. So I thought this could be, what you say, a best practice.
Yeah, definitely. This is really great. Thank you for sharing that. That's a really great practice. But I will emphasize, globally, guys, we need more work to do, okay? We're far from getting to where we need to get to. So there's still, and all of us have to, can play a huge role. There's still so much gaps when it comes to disability and crisis. So promise me, everyone, take that forward. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. We have another person in the room who wants to share a best practice, please.
It's not a best practice, it's a question. My name is Arlene Atherton, and I represent TBIRA, Traumatic Brain Injury Recovery Association, and a lot of disabilities focusing on physical disabilities. My question is, what's going on in areas that are neurologically oriented?
It's a really good question, and I think this goes back to, in so many ways, disability is not all visible. There's a lot that are non-apparent. There's a lot that, and when we talk about emergency planning and crisis response, and we need to take the entire breadth in terms of all different types of disability, which includes a neurodiverse and intellectual and cognitive disabilities, et cetera. So, and I think this goes back to why it's important for us to have more aggregate data. We're far from there. Why we need to make sure we keep sharing these stories, because people with non-apparent disabilities and intellectual disabilities and others are very much, there's a lot of horrific stories in terms of how they're disproportionately impacted. So thank you for asking that question.
Yes, I'm going to do a few questions from online, and then we'll come right to you. Thank you. We had some great questions from online, Special Advisor. The first one that I'd like to ask you is, what are the opportunities associated with reintegrating disabled veterans in post-conflict society?
I think there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of work. I'll take Ukraine as an example. Ukrainians, veterans with disabilities has been a big focus, and actually we've had a lot of visitors from Ukraine to the U.S. to learn about the best practices that we have when it comes to veterans with disabilities and reintegration. And the beautiful thing about this is when we really elevate the lens and the experiences of veterans with disabilities and break down barriers for them, this will also break down barriers for persons with disabilities. But we also need to make sure we don't take the other extreme where we only focus on veterans with disabilities, but we also focus on the entire population, including people with disabilities, because a lot of time we're left behind. So, but that's a really important, a community that is part of kind of the framework when we're talking about crisis and disability.
Thank you. I'm glad you raised the importance of being mindful of the fact that sometimes people are treated very differently depending on the origin of their disability, and that's something to be very mindful of. A second question from online. Are there specific conferences or platforms for people with disabilities to advocate for inclusion when governments don't have the instinct to include them?
So for instance, I recommend for us to, yes, there's a lot of different global the disability conferences. Definitely check them out. There's going to be a Global Disability Summit next April in Germany, co-hosted by Germany and Jordan. There's the annual UN Conference of State Parties in June. But I also would take a step back and see what are other conferences that we, as a disability community, can insert ourselves in, right? And for me, the Munich Security Conference, I think that's a space where we need more disability voice there. NATO, mapping out what NATO does, and if there's any conferences where civil society can attend and integrate, how do we make sure we're part of those spaces? OSCE, next year Finland will be hosting OSCE, and I think there are going to be opportunities for civil society to be part of those conversations. So again, I would ask. High level, map out security conferences, crisis conferences that are not thinking about disability, and insert yourself there.
Fantastic advice, thank you. The final question from online that I wanted to share with you actually echoes a previous question, but is specific on psychiatric disabilities. And this person is asking whether and how people with psychiatric disabilities fit into the playbook that you and your team have developed for international disability rights.
It's an important lens. Now, the playbook is general, high level, in the sense that we don't say for visually impaired and blind X, for people with, it's more about giving them the understanding first disability is diverse, and you have intellectual, cognitive, psychosocial, physical, sensory, etc., right? But the focus is then for our embassies, from the ambassador to the DCM to different sections, political, economic, public affairs, consular, all these different sections to say, what are your priorities and how do you see disability fit within those priorities? And then when we talk about let's bring in the disability lens into those priorities, understanding that disability is diverse and you have these different types of disabilities, right? So we're not kind of focusing on one specific, we're giving them the framework and the landscape, and then for them to really say, we need to make sure we're reaching out to the disability community, which include people with psychosocial disability.
Thank you. Something that I'm really taking away from today, and I think that everyone is that every single person has a role to play.
Yes.
Everybody has a role to play. I saw another question in the room. Can we invite you to ask your question? With the microphone, please. Yes.
Good morning. My name is Betsy Valnes, and I have been a contributor to the disability movement, both domestically and internationally. And I really appreciate what you're saying. You can feel it in your soul. And I think one of the things that you had mentioned or asked earlier about ideas when it comes to social reconstruction, one of the things is that it's obviously very unfortunate when we have to really consider what that reconstruction is if it is a post-conflict situation. But it can also be applied to the evolving humanity in which we live, that there's constantly reconstruction happening. And when we're given the opportunity to reconstruct, to ask the question, I think one of the fundamental questions is, who is not present at this table that should be, in order for that to be inclusive? How is it that we are perceiving the definition of inclusion, and how can that definition be broadened, and by bringing in those perspectives? So I share that as just something that came from what you said that I think is really fundamental, and in an unfortunate way when it's post-conflict that has to be done, but there are other instances in which we can selectively pose for that to be done. So just if you have thoughts about that and what maybe your vision is there something that you are really working toward that you see as an ideal vision that would be fulfilling or that you would find fulfilling?
Thank you so much for sharing that, Betsy. And so a couple thoughts based on what you said, and I agree. It's, we need to ask the question, who should be at the table that's not at the table, right? But sometimes I hear the phrase, if you're not at the table, bring a seat up to the table. But actually, for us in the disability community, a lot of time it's not accessible even to access the table. Physically, if you're deaf, if you're communication-wise, if you're blind, you're unable to, all these different things, you might not have able to even access the table. I was at a big business summit earlier this year, and amazing opportunity, and it was just but there was of course not accessible, of course disability was not brought up in the content, of course, but like if a person with a disability wanted to access it, they wouldn't be able to. So again we need to understand that we need to break down those barriers so we can bring people to the table. On the other hand, I will also ask the question, in a room like this, right, in any conference, let's say we're any of us speaking at a conference or in a room or in a meeting, who should be in the room that needs to hear this message? A lot of times we have this disability community, we talk to each other, we talk to allies, we talk to partners, but we're not inviting people that are not thinking about us sometimes, right? So this is where, like, how do we intentionally also ask the question, who's not in the room? And the other side of the equation. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. And we have another question from the room. Yes, please.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. My name is Eden Rivera. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland in College Park, and my research is actually focused on inclusion of learners with disability. And thank you so much for all the information and insight today. My question is surrounding UDL, Universal Design for Learning and Living. How does that come into play? Do you see that being implemented, discussed in the spaces that you've been domestically and abroad?
So, it's a good question, and yes, all of our work is internationally. Where does it play a role? I mean, universal design learning. For us, is actually we're starting a lot of times with conversations with government agencies and ministers in a very from a level of actually just introducing this concept. So our role has been in traveling the world and meeting with different government folks is understanding their work, understanding their priorities, understanding their challenges, and then we come and say, well, we would love to share some of our practices here in the U.S. And this is where we connect them then to best, good, and promising practices that we have either in the U.S. or even all over the world, that's something that we've learned. So UDL comes up, but it's something that we are necessarily, we're the connectors. And if you have good practices that you think we should know about, connect with my team, because we're always trying to connect great practices with the world. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question in the room, if somebody has a question to ask. If not, I have a burning question myself. I always have them in reserve. Yes, please.
Hello.
I wish I had a fancy title, but I'm Emily Miner. I'm a student. And I was curious, going back to, I'm applying to Gallaudet. I'm within transition periods, but I was wondering, back to your point about bringing more inclusion into universities, not only bringing this topic to be, Gallaudet being a mostly deaf population, they deal with this kind of, policy talk every day, or similarly, I was wondering how best can students who know about this kind of thing and who are interested bring this to people who, as you have said, aren't listening to this, haven't thought about this, and should, and how can this bring a future of youth into rooms such as this, into conferences such as this?
A good question. Students can play a huge role. It's a really good question. So whether students can bring it into their, what are they called? Like student clubs, whatever they're called. These topics, so for instance, the Kennedy School, I think they established a disability justice group. I don't forget. Anyways, some kind of group. But whether you bring it to student groups and student clubs, whether you bring it to faculty and professors and say, hey, we would love to do research on this topic, or are you thinking about this topic? Whether you bring it to academic deans and say, hey, are you thinking about a course like this? Whether you actually do research on this topic, right? I think there's so many different avenues that students can actually amplify and bring up that work. And that's what I've seen in my kind of college and grad school experiences. Students can really play a huge role to really push faculty members to think about this topic. So,
thank you. Since we have just a couple minutes before we have to wrap up, I would love to just ask you another question that's been on my mind, and that is, we're 5.5 years following the UNSCR 2475, its creation, and its 5 years on. This is the UN Security Council resolution on the protection of persons with disabilities in conflict situations and crises, and incorporating them into peacebuilding. And it's been heralded as a landmark resolution, but it's also been said that it's not been as effective as one had hoped. Do you have thoughts on what U.S. policymakers, what other stakeholders could be doing to strengthen 2475?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think, how do we bring the topic of disability, peace, and security, and maybe partner up with I think Women, Peace, and Security has done brought a lot of visibility to their work and their efforts. And I know, like, for instance, like we've established WPS hubs in different parts of the world, like Philippines and Kosovo and others. How do we partner up with them to really amplify some of the work? Not to say disability, peace, and security is exactly women, peace, and security, but there's a lot of things that we can learn and amplify. How do we get other country allies and like-minded partners to be partners with us on this, and create shared responsibility? This is where I would say, like, let's take a space like NATO, and how do we have a disability, peace, and security strategy within NATO and really push on the implementation of UN Security Council resolution? So how do we bring this topic to the space of Munich Security Conference? So I think there's one, creating more awareness on this topic in different avenues. There's two, is thinking strategically what could be possible allies and partners, whether it is partnering up with Women, Peace, and Security, or whether it is partnering up with other security kind of partners. And third is creating that shared responsibility. It shouldn't just be the disability community pushing on this. And how do we get our military colleagues over at DoD to think about this? How do we get, so I guess it's a lot of kind of that shared responsibility that we need to do. One thing that we've had great kind of partnership with is Lisa Kana, who was the ambassador in Lima, Peru, and we did the playbook with her in her embassy, and now she's heading the INR department in the State Department, and now she's been working on making sure there's more disability analytic that the INR is doing and collecting more research on that front, right? So again, it's finding these partners and these people that are willing to do the work with us, so then we can really amplify this work. So we need to do more.
Thank you. That was very useful. And yes, we do need to do more. And I'm glad that you said so clearly that there is a disability, peace, and security agenda. It's 20 years younger than women, peace, and security. It's 10 years younger than youth, peace, and security. But it is here. It is only going to become more powerful over the coming decades, and with the work of all of us in the room and all of us online, of course. Special Advisor, we have covered so much ground. Before I wrap this up and thank everyone, I was wondering if you had a final thought or two that you'd like us to take forward. You've already given us so much.
So my final thought is, with your work and with your colleagues as well, I would ask the same thing to your colleagues. Ask them, what are your top 3 priorities in your work? Okay? Then ask them, how does disability fit into those priorities? I'm not asking what disability things you're working on. No. How does disability fit into those 3 priorities? Then ask the question, what does success look like? Okay? That's my ask of you, is do those 3 questions, okay? Thank you.
Thank you so much for this rich conversation, for so many insights, for so many actionable items that you've given us to take forward. Thank you for your leadership on this issue and everything that you and your team have done to advance disability rights around the world. Thank you to our audience online. Thank you to our audience in the room. And I'd invite everyone to join me in thanking Special Advisor Minkara.
Thank you for listening to this event. If you'd like to listen to more events or explore our other podcasts, visit usip.org/podcasts.